We've got a relative debate here where we have Sugar Cyanide on one hand, who insists that Jesus Christ was married to Mary Magdalene. I'm going to assume source materials are going to be like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and whatnot. And then we have Mr. Bell here, who is going to argue against. Now, I'm going to open this and moderate this to an extent here by saying,
I'm out of this discussion.
You in Radio Land, I'm going to quote from you the Gospel of Philip, where a lot of the argument it has some grounds. There is what you call a lacuna in the manuscript. Now, a lacuna, apart from being part of Lacuna Coil, which is an awesome Italian goth band, a lacuna is a hole that develops in a manuscript because ants or some other critter eats it, or it's burnt or whatever. And there's a big chunk missing out of the Gospel of Philip, where it says that Mary Magdalene was a disciple that Jesus loved most, and that he kissed her on the...
Wait for it.
Blank.
Special place.
No, nothing. That's where the lacuna is.
Nothing.
That's where the hole in the manuscript is, right there.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to Skuzzy's Wild Kingdom on 1380 The X from the MLM Law Group Studios. So, aside from chomping on our jaw here, because that's professional. Sorry, I don't have time for cough drops, all right? I just chomp them.
We've got some serious stuff coming up, though.
We do. Sugar is going to debate here. Professor Bell here. Sugar, give us the rundown here, because we've got some good answers, by the way, to the question.
Cool.
All right. Did.
Okay, so first off, I am not a religious scholar. Well, I guess I'm a scholar, but not a religious professional. No, I'm a reverend. So,
well, that doesn't make you a scholar.
Right.
That's true. Right. I'm a self-studied scholar. I'm not a. I don't.
That makes
I
you a
have
narcissist.
No, I have no.
Yes.
Yes. What was that word again, Professor Bell?
Autodidact.
Yes. I'm an autodidact. If I said that correctly.
That sounds masturbatory and solipsist, but I'll go with it.
So I what I'm trying to say is I have no official education. So I'm just kind of going off of what I can. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to work on building a circumstantial argument. And the reason why I decided to go the circumstantial route is because we don't really know for sure. And there is no way to know 100% for sure.
Well, that is faith.
So,
yes.
well, I'm not Christian, so that doesn't work for me.
Right.
So you have no horse in this race either way.
See.
So, but in my time studying and prepping for this, which I did about, I don't know, a week and a half worth of study versus, Professor Bell over here, who has college degrees in this, 4 or 5 years of study. I did about a week and a half worth of study. And what I came to understand is that when Jesus was touring the Sea of Galilee and Israel and all of that.
It's touring with Motorhead back then, right?
When he was traveling from town to town to town with his disciples, it was a mixed group. And when I mean by mixed group, it was a mixture of men and women. It was not just a group of all men.
Correct.
Now, this might sound like not a big deal in this modern age. But
it was a big deal back then.
But back then, men and women were not allowed to socialize with each other.
Judaism did not always have the most favorable opinion of women at the time period.
Yes, they were not allowed.
It was a patriarchal society.
Yes, they were not allowed to socialize with each other unless you were related or married to somebody. You were not allowed to interact
unless
with another
somebody
person.
boned somebody somewhere within your family line.
Basically,
Or you yourself did that boning.
So...
Right.
So the fact that they were a mixed group of men and women was very enlightening to me. But what was also very enlightening is that because most of the early church at that time took place in people's homes, because they were basically a pack of gypsies roaming from place to place.
Well, and most boning does take place in the home.
But since most of the early church took place in people's homes, a lot of women became church leaders. And this is really huge that women became church leaders and church teachers. And there is evidence of this. Paul ends a letter to Rome with a roll call of 26 leaders of the early church. The top 4, that means the first 4 people listed, were women.
Go girls.
So this is a huge deal. And part of the reason why I believe that the topic of Mary Magdalene is so controversial is because she was considered a peer. As the more and more I got into the evidence, it looked like that she was Jesus's second in command out of the little troop of ragbad travelers.
Now, what do you base that upon? Give me some specifics here.
Yeah, because I always thought she was more mothering him than...
Well, no, he had his mother.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a different Mary.
Yeah, that was a different Mary. Well, firstly, because when he rose from the dead, he was the first person she went to. Or he was the first person.
Well, depending on which gospel that you're reading, that's the thing, is that the synoptics would imply that Mary was the first, but the synoptics are not the only source.
Because when you
4 gospels.
When you go through the first 4 gospels, it says that she went to the tomb to oil his body, to take care of his body.
Yeah.
Yep. And there's another argument with that as well, by the way. But she went to the tomb, and it was
the lubrication argument is what you're saying.
Yes, the lubrication argument.
Sponsored by K1.
But I'll get back to that in a second. But she went to the tomb, and he appeared to her in the garden right after she'd left the tomb, right after she realized that he was not in his tomb. So he appeared to her first before everybody else. So there's that. In fact, when he appeared to her, he specifically said to her, "Do not touch me," which implies that she had touched him in the past, that they had a physical relationship, at the very least, we'll say friendship, where she hugged him and touched him. But what you need to understand is in that time period, that was unheard of for a male or a female to even hold hands or hug each other unless they were married or siblings. Okay.
All right, so... Well, that may be true, though I would add that very little about Jesus's earthly ministry, given that it existed, was conventional. Very little of it was normal as we would understand it.
But as you know, as a boundary pusher, when you are pushing boundaries, there are certain boundaries that you're willing to push, and then there are other ones that you won't cross because that undermines the other message.
Yeah, because, truth be told, I mash buttons, I press buttons like I'm cheating at Mortal Kombat.
Yes, but there are things that you don't, and I know you personally, and I know there are things that there are certain lines you don't cross. And so what I'm saying here is that for him to kiss her, to touch her, they had some sort of relationship that was outside the normal bounds of their society. And if he wanted patronship, and what I mean by patronship
or
is...
matronship in this regard.
Or matronship, but patronship, I'm using that
Sugar
term.
mama.
And in the terms of people basically paying his bills, feeding him, housing him, things of that nature, which he's going to need to have.
Parsonage.
Yes, exactly. He would not thumb his nose at that particular taboo, because then he would have a very difficult time of having people give him money.
Fair enough.
I mean, there's taboos, and then there's taboos. And he broke a lot of the taboos of the time.
That was the hallmark of his entire career.
Yes.
Was that he broke down barriers. He broke taboos.
Yes.
Broke careers.
He did. He ruined so many careers. Notably that of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Exactly. But at the same time, he is not going to be running around from town to town with a lover
Now,
that
keep
he's
in
not
mind-
married to.
Now, that Magdalene is a transliteration of a description. Her name was not Magdalene. Her name was Mary. And Magdalene is a transliteration of the word maudlin.
There's several
The maudlin
definitions
at the well.
She
was mopey. She
Well,
was
No,
there was
there's
a place
several-
name. It was Magdala. It was that's the most
that's
common
Yeah.
place. But now, and I just want to. Were you?
Yeah,
Was
go
that
ahead.
okay? I mean, you've said a number of things, and there's a sort of the first point that I want to make has to do with the quality of evidence. When we're asking a historical question, of course, we want to know what the most reliable historical evidence is. There is no question. I mean, for example, when Skuzzy was mentioning the lacuna in the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Philip, the reason we say, well, there's a hole there in the text is because we have one manuscript for the Gospel of Philip. Dates from the 3rd century. Okay, the 3rd century. Now, Jesus, of course, lived in the 1st century.
And it's
The
very clearly a
canonical
Gnostic
Gospels, right? The canonical Gospels, take what you will regarding the messages and so on and so forth, are indisputably earlier than anything that's in the Gnostic corpus. Not just earlier, but 200 some odd years
Yeah,
earlier.
the only difference, the only variation would be maybe the Gospel of Thomas. That
Okay,
would be
now
earlier.
in the Gospel of Thomas, actually an interesting case because we
Parts of it
see
are earlier.
we see that in the Mary Magdalene is depicted in the Gospel of Thomas. She asks a question at the very end of the Gospel of Thomas. We read a rather peculiar passage where Peter objects to Mary being in the group and says, "Send her away because women are not worthy." And Jesus says, "I myself will make her male, and any woman who makes herself male will be worthy of the kingdom." Now, that is actually repeated by Mary herself in the Gospel of Mary. Mary says we should be thankful to the Lord, for he has prepared us and made us into men. Now, that's in the Gospel of Mary, which is also often cited with this
Now, that's
idea
a
of
Gnostic
the marriage.
theme, though, is that the male become female and the female become
Well,
male.
and this is an interesting point about Gnosticism. Gnosticism was very anti-literal, which means that the Gnostics, even in the Gospel of Philip, and again, the Gospel of Philip is important here because of this idea of kissing and so on. But let me back up for just a minute before I hit that, because I think that one of the important things to speak about is, again, when we rank the evidence, we can ask ourselves, what do we know about Mary Magdalene from the New Testament, from the canonical Gospels? And what we find out about her, firstly, we meet her. She has 7 demons expelled from her. Then we see that she has become a follower of Jesus. She financially supports Jesus. Now, it's true. She did travel in a mixed group. But now here's an interesting point about that. The New Testament, which is, again, the earliest evidence that we have, never singles her out. She's with Joanna, Susanna, many other women.
Right.
So if the argument is to be that men and women could not have been together unless they were related or unless they were married, then one must suppose that Jesus was married to multiple women or that he was related to them. So I think this idea of boundary pushing and taboo breaking is important, but I think that in terms of a calculation, where we get this prohibition on men and women mingling is not in the canon, but it is actually in the Jewish traditions of the elders that Jesus condemned. I would say he would have no... Yeah, the Mishnah. There would be no reason why Jesus would not have hesitated to sort of flout those particular conventions, and he did so. Women were followers; they learned from him, and this was very much against the grain of the society at the time. Now, I have a bit more here because I think it's important to go through the non-canonical, the extra-biblical texts and see just what they actually say about Mary Magdalene. Pick it up after...
Yeah, we definitely need to take a quick break.
All right, let me just summarize the previous statement that I had made. I was talking about the canonical Gospels and the evidence that's in there regarding Mary Magdalene. reviewed. She was a follower, but the canonical Gospels say nothing regarding any kind of a marriage. In fact, the group that she traveled with would suggest that it was just that. It was a group of followers. Was it non-conventional? Conventional? Certainly it was. Does it imply a marriage? Not from the canonical Gospels alone. In order to get that sort of an edge, one has to move to some of the much later documentation. And when one does that, again, one sees Mary Magdalene is mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter. She's mentioned in the Dialogue of the Savior. She's mentioned in the Pista Sophia. She's mentioned in the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip. Now, these two Gospels are more familiar to people. They showed up in the Da Vinci Code in the movie. There's Tom Hanks and Ian McKellen debating regarding the canon. And, Ian McKellen's character at some point quotes from the Gospel of Mary, where there is a dispute about Mary's being more favored, and Levi chimes in and reprimands Peter and says, if the Savior has made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? And then we go into the Gospel of Philip. And it's interesting, and I mentioned this last week, that the Ian McKellen character says, Mary Magdalene was kissed by the Savior, and then he says, and he used to kiss her and then he trails off. He's interrupted by Tom Hanks or some kind of a business interrupts this, but it's actually, again, the lacuna. Now, there is another lacuna in that text, which Skuzzy didn't mention, and that is we don't know who is objecting in the Gospel of Philip to Mary's being given this special status. It doesn't say disciples. It could be women for all we know. We don't know who's objecting. But the real thing I want you to understand is that these are very late documents. These come from the second, in the case of the Gospel of Mary, or the 3rd century. They're not considered reliable historically because of that fact. Now, there's a second point, though, and this, again, comes from Bart Ehrman, who is by no means an evangelical or a Christian or anything like that. He abandoned his Protestant upbringing. And he points out that the Gospel of Philip, being a Gnostic gospel, has very much de-emphasized the literal interpretation. In fact, in the Gospel of Philip, the sayings that are juxtaposed there sort of poke fun at people who take things literally. So the virgin birth, for example, not literal. If you think it's literal, you miss the point, according to the Gospel of Philip. Resurrection, not literal. If you think it's literal, you miss the point. So again, it seems odd then that the marriage is meant to be taken as a historical fact, when in fact in the Gospel of Philip, the word kiss is described earlier on as a sort of a symbol for transmitting gnosis. And this is in the Gospel of Philip. Prior to Jesus used to kiss her on her whatever, we hear that the word kiss is, again, a transmission for gnosis. Conceiving ideas. This shows up in the Gospel of Philip. The word companion. Mary is called Jesus' companion. And contrary to Tom Hanks's character's assertion in the Da Vinci Code, the word companion there means partner. It shows up in the Bible. In Luke 5, verse 10, the same word, koinonos.
But we also use the term partner for companion, like
we
life
do
partner.
Today. We do today. But this is the issue here, though, is what did the word in the original language mean? Koinonos, despite the fact that in today's world, the word partner is, a designation for an alternative arrangement or maybe a conventional arrangement. The word, as it shows up in the biblical text, for example, in Luke 5:10, Peter is fishing, and he talks about his business partners, the other fishermen, koinonos. In the book of Hebrews 10, verse 33, we hear about people standing together under persecution, koinonos, their partners.
At the very least, it proves that Jesus considered Mary his equal.
Well, at the very least, it proves that the Gnostics of the 3rd century considered Jesus and Mary Magdalene to be related in some way. But again, it's not historical it's not reliable as a piece of historical evidence.
And I actually have an argument of why she's not in the canon, as we can call it. I believe she was written out. I believe she was written out and crossed out. And there is evidence to prove that. One, there was the whole argument between her and Peter. There's several references throughout where if you look at the evidence, it seems like after Jesus was on the cross, I was going to say died, but I guess if you consider him risen, he didn't die. But after Jesus was no longer on this earthly plane, there seems to have been a power struggle. And it looked like it was a power struggle between Mary and Peter. And as those of you who are church scholars know, Peter was the founder of the Christian church as we know it. So I am arguing that the reason why Mary is not in the canon is because history is written by the winners.
Well, history, let me just jump in there because history is written by the winners, but it doesn't necessarily mean the winners are wrong. That's the first point. But secondly, the idea that Mary Magdalene was written out, the idea of a conflict, again, comes from the 3rd century. We don't get an idea of a conflict in any of the contemporary documents. So those would have to be written out too. And so, in other words, this kind of cover-up then has to be fairly broad-based. But I would suggest that there are reasons in the canon that this isn't the case. For example, you mentioned one yourself when you said that Paul listed a number of female church leaders. There would have been very little reason. What would have been the reason to write Mary Magdalene out if Paul also lists other female church leaders?
But in Timothy, in the same canon, in Timothy, it says that I permit no women to teach or have authority over men. And that's 1 Timothy 2:12. So I think the fact that the Bible itself contradicts itself is evidence.
Where's the contradiction?
Well, if Paul has a list of church leaders, and then in St. Timothy, it says, I permit no women to teach or have authority over a man. If you're a church leader, you're going to have authority over men,
well, see, and I think
you're also going to be
there's two ways of looking at the text. So one way of looking at the text would be to say, oh, there's a contradiction. The other way of looking at the text would be to say, if we know from clear teaching in the book of Timothy that women are not supposed to have these roles, then we have to reevaluate the list that was given. And so I think that that's really the direct route. But the idea of suppression, I think, really doesn't hold much water. And here's the reason, one of the main reasons why, is the earliest evidence that we have, again, comes from the New Testament canon. We get a very clear picture of the sincere belief that the apostles had in Jesus.
But there's no reason. Why.
Well, if we're supposing, though, that Jesus was married, let's just think about this for a minute. Go back to the Gospel of Peter. If Jesus had been married, why would they have asked him about the affection that he showed? It would have been obvious. Nobody comes, if I'm married and my wife comes in here and I kiss her, is everybody here going to go, why do you like her better than us? That's the question in the text. What sense does that make? If it was common knowledge that Mary was
because
Jesus's
he treated her as an equal partner, as a business partner, not just his wife.
Yeah, but that doesn't come out from the text. Now you're just sort of you're telling a story based on the text.
You're making her into his Yoko Ono.
Well, no, I mean it's not. That doesn't come out in the text.
But,
again, we don't have enough information in the Gospel of Philip.
And I can say why there's not enough information. In 180 AD, Bishop Leon wanted to streamline the Bible and called for a single book to be published. And because of that, everything that did not fit into what was considered canon by 180 AD was destroyed.
Well, the Gospel of Philip wasn't even written in 180 AD, that first point. So the second point, though, is that Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon in 180 AD, actually was martyred for his faith. Now, here's an important point. I think there was, we think of the Vatican now, and we think of the Vatican treasure and all of the power and so on, but Peter had not got any of that. We have to be clear. Peter's reward for being the leader of the church was to be crucified.
Upside down.
Okay. And all through the 2nd century, there was no power. There was no idea that, well, if we just hold on and suppress this Mary Magdalene idea, that we're going to come out with flying colors at the end of this persecution. The 2nd century, I think, really sounds the death knell for this sort of conspiracy stuff. Perhaps it makes sense in the 4th century. By the time you get to Constantine, and this is why Dan Brown ignores the 2nd century and goes to Constantine, goes to Theodosius, because by that time, once Christianity does become tolerated under Constantine, and then the official religion under Theodosius, then it becomes more plausible that something like this would take root. But the idea here is that these ideas of Mary Magdalene and a power struggle are not in any document prior to the late second and early 3rd century, which is, again, 250 years after.
Now, what about the Gospel of Thomas?
Well, but the Gospel of Thomas lends absolutely no weight to the idea that they were married. As I mentioned, Mary shows up in there. She asks a question in saying 21, and then she's rebuked in question 114 or saying 114, and Jesus says the remedy for that is to make her male. The key point is that Gnostic texts de-emphasized the literal. Gnostics de-emphasized marriage. They de-emphasized the body. They would not have been at all amused with the fact or behind the fact that Jesus had been married. Docetism, in fact, held that Jesus was not even incarnated, that he did not even have a literal
physical body.
But let me just say about the canon. First of all, the issue with the canon, again, has to do with who authored the canon, the date of the canon. These were the issues that the church was concerned with. Many books that are orthodox were excluded from the canon. One of them was the Didache. And I'll give you an example. This comes from Bart Ehrman's book, The Lost Scriptures. The Didache, perfectly orthodox and respectable book, completely lost from the time that it was penned in the early 2nd century until 1873 when it was discovered. Now, the same story with the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip.
Or
even as Karen King,
even like the Book of Enoch or the
that's
Shepherd of
earlier.
Hermas.
But Karen King, who is done more than any other scholar to promote the Gospel of Mary, even she admits that these Gospels may simply have fallen out of favor. Now, here's the point. If you read the Gospel of Philip, if you read the Gospel of Mary, you start to get this really convoluted Gnostic cosmology. The plain fact of the matter is it was not popular. It's convoluted. It's difficult to understand. And the fact of the matter is the Christians who were going to their deaths from the 1st to the 2nd century were simply not, exactly, they were not doing it for Gnosticism.
Now, I will say that if the Western school, we have very little time left, just letting you know. We have 4 minutes to conclude this.
Yes.
No.
Since we have very little time left, I have one last piece of evidence, and then I'm going to summarize.
We have a winner in our contest.
My point. The one last piece of evidence between the struggle of leadership between, I want to say, the women and men in the early church is there was a painting found in 1906. Of Paul flanked by 2 women that were in a teaching posture, and the women in the painting were defaced. And so this was a cave painting, a cave drawing that was done. So, unfortunately, I didn't write down the name of the painting because my notes are horrible.
Or the defacers.
Yes, but the women were defaced. And,
what we need is a date. I mean, we always need to work with a date on any kind of document to see whether or not it just goes, because that's really the issue. The final point I'd like to make is, had Jesus been married, there would have been no problem with Orthodox Christianity. Contrary to what is said in the Da Vinci Code, Orthodox Christianity does not hold that Jesus is God, period. Holds that Jesus is God and man. Jesus is fully God and fully man. He breathes, he eats, and so on and so forth. None of that poses a problem for orthodoxy. A marriage wouldn't either. It's simply the case that there is no good evidence that he was married. That is the reason why the church does not.
I actually I agree with you when you're saying Orthodox Christianity, but the Catholic Church has a problem with him being married.
The Catholic Church has lots of problems.
And because that dispels the myth of him being a virgin and that his mother is a virgin, and it kind of, have this whole issue with sex.
You're confusing terms there. The issue is not, Jesus is not held to, the Catholic Church, first of all, is Orthodox in the sense that I meant it. I didn't mean Orthodox as in a branch of Christianity. I meant Orthodox as in what Bart Ehrman calls at the time the proto-Orthodox, the people that proceeded from Peter. The virgin birth is the idea that Mary gave birth without any kind of sexual act from any human male father.
Have you seen my wiener?
But Jesus is being a virgin is simply a historical fact, if it is. Or if he had been married, it would be a historical fact. It would pose no problem even then. But in Paul, you mentioned Paul, he's asked about being able to take a believing wife. And he says, why shouldn't we be allowed to, like Peter did? Many of the apostles did. Had Jesus had a wife, we would have read about that in 1 Corinthians 9. Jesus himself is quoted in Mark 19 regarding making oneself a eunuch for the kingdom of God.
Couldn't it be argued that the Apostle Paul knew very precious little about the historical Jesus?
Well, some have argued it, but I think it's a very tentative. I think that, again, the best evidence that we have is the New Testament documents. Like them or not, agree with their conclusions or not, from a historical point of view, no other document comes close to it. In terms of dating, in terms of the textual evidence, again, we have 3 copies of the Gospel of Mary, none complete. 1 copy of the Gospel of Philip. We have 5,600 copies of the documents that make up the New Testament in the original Greek. And if you count Coptic, Latin, then the numbers skyrocket. I mean, the textual evidence for the New Testament is better than for any book of antiquity on any subject whatsoever.